Welcome to the Happier and Healthier podcast. I'm your host, Maria Marlowe, and this is a place where we don't rely on good luck or good genes for our health and happiness, but rather we create it with our thoughts and our actions each and every single day. Each week, I'll bring you a thought or a guest that will help you live your happiest and healthiest life. Are you ready? Welcome back to the Happier and Healthier podcast. Today, I'm thrilled to bring you Dr. Terry Wahls. Dr. Wahls is a traditional MD turned functional medicine MD who is most well known for developing the Wahls protocol after healing herself from MS. She, at one point, had ended up in a wheelchair and was just getting progressively worse, but then she decided to dig into the research, to study functional medicine, and ultimately she drastically changed her diet and lifestyle. Lo and behold, her MS symptoms started to reverse, and she was eventually able to get out of that wheelchair and even start biking and running again. She's here to share some tips from her latest book, The Wahls Protocol, a radical new way to treat all chronic autoimmune conditions using paleo principles. Before we get started, check out these brands that make the Happier and Healthier podcast possible. If you're looking for better health and especially better digestion, then you have to check out my favorite probiotic brand, Hyperbiotics. Digestive health is the root of our overall health, and it's so important to get it under control and get it healthy. Not just so you're not embarrassed with gas and bloating or constantly running to the bathroom or maybe never running to the bathroom because you're constipated. It is so important that we nourish our gut and take care of our gut, because when it's not healthy and it's not working properly, it's only a matter of time before we start seeing other health problems, whether that's skin problems, autoimmune problems, and lower immunity because our digestive system is so intricately linked with our immune system, and so much more. So if you're having digestive issues currently, gas, bloating, diarrhea, constipation, of course, definitely check with your doctor, but you probably also want to look into a probiotic. Dr. Wahls, thanks so much for being here.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Well, as listeners of this podcast know, I actually mention you all the time on the show whenever we're talking about autoimmune disease, because you have quite a unique and interesting story.
Yeah.
Let's start there.
Sure. So I am a professor of medicine here at the University of Iowa. And certainly was a very conventional physician, very skeptical of special diets, supplements, functional medicine. But, God has a mysterious way of teaching us. So in 2000, I developed some weakness in my left leg, got a big evaluation, was ultimately diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And again, being professor of medicine, I certainly believe in the best drugs, the newest technology. So I did some research, found the best center in the country, saw them, selected their best people, took the newest drugs, and went steadily downhill. Now, 2 years into this, my physicians told me about the work of Loren Cardane. I read his books, his papers, and after a lot of prayer and meditation, I went back to eating meat. That was a big deal because I'd been a low-fat vegetarian for about 20 years. So I gave up all grain, all legumes, all dairy, and resumed eating meat, continued to decline. It was taking ever more aggressive drugs, including those new biologics. And it was very apparent, and the next year I needed a tilt recline wheelchair. It was very apparent that the best drugs, the best docs were not likely to stop this march towards a bedridden, demented, and possibly intractable pain. Because another part of my symptom complex was trigeminal neuralgia, which actually had started during medical school back in 1980. And these episodes were more frequent, more severe, and much more difficult to turn off. So I ultimately decided to start reading the basic science literature about the animal models for multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, Alzheimer's, and would decide that mitochondria were a big driver in all of those conditions. And so I would continue to do some research and would develop a supplement protocol specifically for my mitochondria. And I figured out that that made my fatigue slightly less, and it slowed the speed of my decline. So I'm immensely grateful. But, I am still declining. By the summer of 2007, I'm so weak I cannot sit up in a regular chair. There's a zero gravity chair with my knees higher than my nose. I have one at work, one at home. And, it's remarkable that the VA and the university have been redesigning my job multiple times to allow me to continue to work. And one of the things that happened was I was assigned to the institutional review board. So I'm helping review clinical trials for safety. And I'm getting more and more comfortable reading the research, and I volunteer to read all the brain-related stuff. So I'm getting a longer list of things I'm taking. Then I discovered the Institute for Functional Medicine. I take their course on neuroprotection. Again, I have a longer list of stuff. And by this time, again, in the summer of 2007, I'm so weak I cannot sit up. I'm beginning to have some brain fog issues. My pain is getting much more severe, much more difficult to manage. And so it's quite apparent that I will soon finally have to apply for medical disability. But I have another really big aha moment, which, of course, you and your tribe will go like, why did it take you so long to see the obvious here? Like, what if I redesign my diet in a very specific way, still following the paleo diet, but if I looked for the food sources of all these things I was taking in supplement form, what happens then? So again, that's several more months of research, and I finally get that worked out. And I start this new way of eating December 26th, 2007. So what I've really done is I created a much more structured paleo diet. And over the next 3 months, it's really quite remarkable. My fatigue is gone, my brain fog is gone, and my pain is gone. And I'm getting stronger. In fact, I can sit up at the table to eat again. That is just stunning. And then it's apparent that I am getting stronger because I've been doing my little physical therapy, and I'm able to do that a little more effectively. My therapist begins advancing my exercises, and we had weightlifting. And then about 6 months into this, I get on my bike for the first time in 6 years. And we bike around the block. My son's jogging with me. My daughter's jogging with me. They're crying. My wife is crying. I'm crying. Because this really feels miraculous. Because I had understood with progressive MS, functions once lost are gone forever. And I'm continuing to work at this. Then about another 3 months, my wife sees that there is a bigger community bike ride, the Courage Ride. And we sign up for that as a family. And of course, it's like, well, however far I can go will be a big deal. Yeah, we go. And in fact, I'm once again able to do the whole bike ride. So once again, my son is crying, my daughter's crying, my wife's crying, I'm crying. And this really transforms how I think about disease and health. It transforms the way I practice medicine, and it will ultimately transform the type of research that I do.
That's an incredible story. I think most people, like you said, when you think of MS, you think it's going in one direction.
Correct.
And you were really the first to show that actually it can reverse. So I want to get back to, you had mentioned that you had followed a vegan or vegetarian diet for a really long time.
Yeah.
What role do you feel that type of a diet had?
Certainly for me, it contributed to my problems. Eventually, I'd come to realize that I have a severe reaction to gluten, dairy, and eggs. If I have any of those foods, in 6 to 24 hours, my electrical face pain turns on. Was it the sole factor as to why I got so disabled? No, absolutely not. It's just one of the contributing factors. We have much more recognition that develop an autoimmunity. And typically there's 200 to 300 different genes that increase your risk slightly. And then there's this intermittent interaction with the foods that you eat, the microbes you have in your gut, the toxins to which you've been exposed, your physical activity levels, your smoking status, your nutrition levels, and probably other stuff they haven't yet figured out, that all interact, that lead to the imbalances in the immune system and the disordered chemical processes in your cells. So, for me, It certainly may have been some vitamin D issues, stress issues, toxin issues, food sensitivities, probable microbiome disruptions, that all together, that led to my illness. And it was by creating this very comprehensive diet and lifestyle program that I was able to reset my immune function and recover. And ultimately get weaned off my disease-modifying drugs with the blessings of my neurologist and flourish, do extremely well.
So tell us a little bit more about this Wahls protocol and what makes it different from a regular paleo diet. What are some of the highlights of this style of eating?
So the paleo diet really focuses on what to remove. So typically they remove grain, they may remove dairy, legumes, and depending on the restrictions, they might also remove nightshades. But they don't give you a lot of guidance on this is what you need to eat. When I integrated what I'd learned in the basic science, functional medicine, to say these are the nutrients that science says this is what's key for your brain and mitochondria. And so I had a template of avoid this and be sure you're getting lots of this. And so that template, I do have a vegetarian and a vegan version, and I give them a little more guidance. So if it's spiritually important to them to be vegetarian or vegan, we provide a process to do that. But if you're willing to eat meat, we have a different process. The things to remove, I have removed our gluten-containing grains, so wheat, rye, barley, and many ancient grains. And then dairy protein, so that's milk, cheese, yogurt. You can still have clarified butter. And then we also remove eggs. We ramp up a key set of vegetables, green leafy things like spinach, Swiss chard, kale, parsley, cilantro. So green leaves that are not poisonous for you, because there are plants that are poisonous. So you still have to positively identify what you're eating. And then sulfur-rich vegetables, and that includes things like cabbage family, onion family, mushroom family vegetables. And then deeply pigmented stuff like beets, carrots, berries. I want people to have fermented foods such as sauerkraut and kimchi. I prefer that they have organ meat, liver once a week, and oysters, mussels, clams. We talk about omega-3 rich fats. And then I have some guidance for who would benefit from a ketogenic diet and guidance for who would benefit from a more restrictive diet that is more of an elimination diet.
So these are some more new things that you've added
Correct.
on to the original.
Right. And then I also talk about histamines. I talk about FODMAPs. I talk about oxalates, how to determine are these likely an issue for you, and if they are, how to address that. And I'm very keen on the benefits of fasting, but I want people to understand that who would benefit from ongoing permanent fasting, permanent, not fasting, but permanent ketogenic eating, who would benefit from more of a intermittent ketogenic eating that is switching more on metabolic switching from being in ketosis to being in the fed state, and how to manage that type of approach. So many more opportunities for personalization. And I'd also tell you, I have some guidance for those how to transition from our standard American diet to the Wahls diet in a more therapeutic diet. Because we have to make these transitions at the pace that they and their families can manage. So I need for them to be successful step by step.
So you mentioned organ meat, and I want to talk about meat in general because I feel there's a lot of misconceptions about it. Mm-hmm. So first, why organ meats? Why are they such an important part of your plan?
Well, the organ meats have a very nice nutritional profile. They're going to be more packed with the mitochondria. So they're actually going to have a much, much higher amount of coenzyme Q, which is a key mitochondrial They are superb sources of B vitamins. Because if it's a grass-fed animal, it'll be a good source of vitamin K, vitamin D, retinol, the pre-made vitamin A. And these are nutrients that are really very important for immune cell health and for mitochondrial function. There's a lot of variability in the efficiency of our body's ability to convert the plant-based carotenoids into the fully functional vitamin A. And so if you don't have enough vitamin A, your retina doesn't work very well. So we have blindness in dim vision because our retina doesn't work well. We also have less effective immune cells, which means that these cells can't protect you from infections such as COVID nearly as efficiently. And they also can't protect you from the internal threats such as cancers and precancers as efficiently. So, I would tell my patients who have a problem with infection vulnerability or a problem with precancers or a problem with autoimmune issues that I really wanted them to have liver once a week. If they wouldn't do that, they would have them take the liver capsules.
And do you have any tips for adding liver to your diet? Do you like sneak it in? Do you eat, how do you add it in?
So as a matter of fact, we just talked about that on my Instagram post. So what I demonstrated was that I put some liver in my food processor and pulse it up. So I grind that up and then mix it with ground meat. And I might add, some garlic, parsley. If you like things really spicy, some hot peppers. So you have a fully loaded ground meat. If you add just some more spice to it, that will mask the organ meat very nicely. And so when you start, you might do a very small amount, like 5, 10%. And it's generally not until you get up past 25% that people can perceive that difference.
Yeah, I'm sure with the garlic and the spices and all that, it's very
nicely.
Yeah.
The other thing, another great technique. So we'd make liver pate. So you fry liver and onions, and then blend it with olive oil, and so you get the desired consistency. And then I would take a kale leaf, put a smear of pate on the kale leaf, put a smear of guacamole on the kale leaf, then take some hot sriracha sauce, squirt that in, and roll it up. And so the sriracha sauce, the guacamole mask the pate very nicely. So my kids actually like that a whole lot, and they like to make that as a treat for their friends. Of course, we don't tell them what they're serving until they're all done. They're like, wow, that actually was pretty tasty.
Yeah, very inventive. I'll have to try that.
Yeah. No, it's really quite delicious. So we make liver and onions and make a big batch so I can make liver pate, and then that's a huge hit.
And you mentioned that you use hot peppers and sriracha sauce. And I know that in some cases with autoimmune, you want to avoid the nightshades.
Correct.
So
Correct.
How do you determine?
How do we sort that out? Absolutely. So if you have an autoimmune condition that involves your gut, so if you have symptomatic inflammatory bowel disease, you'll probably need the elimination diet. If you have an autoimmune condition involving your joints, such as rheumatoid arthritis, systemic lupus, ankylosing spondylitis, you will probably have to remove the nightshades and do more of the elimination diet. When I see people with those categories, I'll tell them that likely they'll do much better if we put them on the elimination diet, and we can start there. If that feels like too big of a leap for them, we can start them on the level 1 diet and see how they do. Because I will say, some folks, even with the higher risk people, if I get them on the level 1 diet, they have a marked improvement in their quality of life and more success. And sometimes that's enough. I certainly have other folks who have been miserable enough, long enough with their severe inflammatory bowel disease or their RA, they're like, okay, particularly when I explain them, this is an experiment. And if you're ready to do the experiment, we can sort of stage it, do level 1 for 100 days. And if that's good enough, you stay there. If it's not good enough, then you go on to the elimination diet. Or we could do the elimination diet starting immediately. And you let me know which way you prefer to go. And many will elect to just go straight away to the elimination diet, but not all. That has to be driven by the patient and their family. What are they comfortable? Because I make it very clear, if you're going to do the experiment, you want to be sure whatever the intervention is, you actually do that intervention. If you decide I'm going to do the elimination diet, but it's really too hard, I'm only do it about 95%, you will not have an answer at the end of your experiment. Could that diet have made a difference?
And I know the question that everyone is thinking right now is how long do they have to try this diet change before they can start to see results?
So again, it will depend on what is it that I'm treating. So I want people to go 100 days before deciding that this is a failure or that I need to go on to the next level of intervention. However, people often are able to tell me that within 30 days, they can see that their energy is improving, their mood is improving, their pain is lessening. And that benefit tends to accrue over time. If it turns out that the person that and so that's for diabetes, obesity, neuropathies, MS, often have big improvements within that first month. If you have rheumatoid arthritis, it turns out you're very sensitive to tomatoes and you're still eating tomatoes, you may not have a symptom reduction until we get you all the way into the elimination diet. So that's a very frank conversation I'll have with folks. And I'll point out that it depends on them. Do they want to be as aggressive as possible immediately? If so, then we'll just go on to the elimination diet. If that feels like that's an overwhelming amount of change, then we'll have the conversation like, okay, so intervention A is the best, but let's begin to explore what feels possible to you that you could actually implement 100%. Because implementing at 95% won't answer the question, could this intervention help you?
I know that's so frustrating for a lot of people. They feel if they're following the elimination diet 95%, they should feel a 95% improvement. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. And if you really want to see the impact a certain food has on your health, you need to follow the elimination 100%.
If people add more vegetables to their diet, get rid of the processed food, even if they're still having some gluten, there will be some minor improvements in health status. There'll be some minor reductions in their inflammatory markers. And so it's certainly a step in the right direction. They're improving their long-term health. That's very clear. So if people aren't willing to do the Wahls diet, I'll tell them, how do you feel about the Mediterranean diet? Eating more vegetables, having some more legumes, reducing the processed foods. And if they're willing to do that, I'll send them to the dietitian and tell them, do the Mediterranean diet. When you're ready to take the next level, give us a call and we'll support you. Because on a public health matter, if you can get people to drop the sugar, drop the processed food, and eat more vegetables on a public health basis, that's an improvement. And on many clinical trials, there is an improvement in quality of life. Will they have the level of improvement that you and I see in people who embrace diet and lifestyle more thoroughly? No, they would do better, but I do want people to continue to make forward progress. So it's not my favorite recommendation. I'll have that conversation to say, okay, what are you open to doing? And we can help get you the resources to begin that journey. It's sort of like the people who have substance abuse issues. We have to tell them many, many times to stop smoking, many times to stop their alcohol before they're finally, and they have to suffer for a long time before the person finally says, you know what, I'll begin. And they may have to have several stopping periods for stopping the cigarettes or stopping their alcohol before they are finally successful on an ongoing basis.
It's true.
That is the nature of health behavior change.
Baby steps lead to big results over time.
Correct. And so we always want to help people make forward progress. I have such a long line of people waiting to see me. I can't let them take up the chairs if they aren't fully in. So we figure out what they're willing to do, and then I refer them to other practitioners in the community who can help them with those baby steps.
I wanted to ask you about red meat because I know that's a controversial topic and a lot of people are very scared to eat red meat.
They're afraid of meat.
But your diet includes red meat, and I'd love for you to share more about that.
You know, and the vegetarian and vegans are very upset because I let people eat meat. My paleo eaters are very upset because I created a program that could work for the vegetarian and vegans. So everyone's a little bit cranky with me because I take care of the population as well as I can. Now, as I designed what I do, I think about reading the basic science. I think about my clinical experience for myself and my patients. And I think a lot about ancestral health principles and evolutionary biology. If we look at our ancestors, and, mammals been around for 200 million years. We've been feeding our young breast milk for 200 million years. And when the young get weaned, they don't get any more breast milk until, the last 8,000 years. That's when we've had the dairy possibility for some humans. So that's a pretty new food. Let's sort of think about, okay, when did we start eating meat in this period? It would look like about 6 million years ago, we separated from the primates. And as we were doing that, we were eating more meat in our diet. And our evolutionary biologists think that it was the meat, it was the shellfish, it was the clams, it was the oysters, it was the bone marrow that we got from the carcasses we harvested after the hyenas and lions were done that let us grow those big brains. And then about 200,000 years ago, we started cooking our food. And once we started doing that, we didn't need as much fermentation in our gut, so our intestines got smaller and our brains got bigger again. And so we have millions of years eating meat. Now, the meat that we were eating was different than the factory farmed meat that we're eating now, because that was all grass-fed, and so it has a different fatty acid mixture. But from an evolutionary standpoint, we have a very long history eating meat. I have a very hard time thinking that meat is bad for humans because our biology evolved eating meat. The factory farms that we're consuming now is a different kind of product, and that may be less healthful than grass-fed, grass-finished wild game meat. And so I'll certainly acknowledge that. What I think the science is much more clear is that the bacteria in our bowels help us digest our food, get those big molecules that's in the food broken down into smaller molecules that get into our bloodstream. And it certainly looks like we rely on these bacteria to properly digest our food, allow us to assimilate it, and run the chemistry of life properly. Is the meat the problem, or is it the processed food that is the problem that fertilize the wrong bacteria? So we have some of the incorrect processes that are happening, not because there's meat in our bowels, but because we have sugar, we have processed grains, sort of this high glycemic index load, a vastly higher load of new, rapidly digested carbohydrates that are feeding the wrong bacteria and yeast. I think that's more likely to be the big problem.
I'm looking at your office. I see some poop emojis in the background.
A lot of poops over my shoulder.
Yeah, so I take it you really are into the microbiome and digestion. Is there anything else that you want to tell us about that, or any ways that we can improve our digestive health?
I think if we reflect on, when I was in medical school, I'm such an old geezer. When I went to medical school, we were all so excited about the Human Genome Project, and that science was working towards understanding our genes. Because if we understood our genes, then we would know how to deal with chronic disease. And it was terribly disappointing when we figured out that we have about 25,000 genes, and corn and wheat have about 100,000 genes. And we thought we'd have 100,000 genes because that's how many proteins we have to make. So it's very baffling, very confusing. And of course, we didn't think our poop was at all valuable. But every farmer, traditional farmer, understood that the poop you put on the soil has a huge impact on fertility of the soil. In that, all that manure, incredibly valuable stuff. Science has come a long way now to realize that we are an ecosystem, that we rely on those bacteria digesting our food, making vitamins, breaking down the food that we eat into smaller molecules that get into our bloodstream. Because if we go back several thousands of generations, as we develop these random mutations that make some of our enzymes not work, if your bacteria can still do that enzymatic step, then your ancestral mother still had reproductive success. And at that moment, that enzyme got exported from your ancestral mother's DNA to her microbiome. And that microbiome DNA got transmitted vagina by vagina by vagina. And so the other 75,000 genes that we need reside in our microbiome. as we became more narrow in our microbiome, because we changed what we eat, we added all this sugar, added all this white flour, quit eating so many vegetables, quit eating so many starchy vegetables, then we're missing more of those genes and our health declines. So we talk a lot about poop. That's why I have all those poop pillows and poop hats. I tell my patients and I tell the public, we need to monitor our poop every single day. When you have a bowel movement, you stand up and you look in the toilet or on the ground if you're just pooping on the ground, and you decide, am I pooping rocks, logs? Are the logs dry or are they sort of smooth? Am I pooping snakes, pudding, or tea? And there are some other poop scales that go by numbers, but that's way too complicated. People all understand rocks, logs, snakes, pudding, and tea. We get that part very easily. If you've got pudding and tea, you have too much inflammation, and you probably need to cook your food, have more bone broths, and we may have to help you with your leaky gut and gut inflammation. If you're pooping rocks, you got the wrong microbes, and you need more fiber, you need more fermented vegetables, more raw vegetables. If you're pooping snakes and they're getting into your pants, you probably still have to back off because it's socially just not going to work to have poop in your pants. So in the end, you want bowel movements that come easily, very comfortably, and you can control. And you either dial up the fiber or you dial back the fiber. So it's a bit more nuanced. But I don't know that, and I've added a microbiologist, immunologist to my study team. We study the microbiome. He and I have many conversations about the microbiome. We don't know what species are associated with best health or what species are associated with the worst health. Because in the microbiome, they're swapping genes all the time too. What you need what are the processes? And so that's a different test called sort of a metabolite test, where we test basically tens of thousands of metabolites in the bloodstream, in the urine, and the stool to understand how these chemical processes are happening, and can you do them all? If you can't do them all, you're missing key microbiomes. So we just do the simple thing. Poop, look at it, and then adjust your diet so you can have easily passed poops. And keep waiting for scientists, me and my medical team, to get a fuller, nuanced understanding of which processes we rely on the microbiome to do for you.
That has to be the best explanation of poop and how to use it, how to use it as a tool.
And why it matters. Yeah. And why it matters.
So very great explanation. Are there any specific gut health tests that you recommend that if someone does have some gut health issues?
Yeah, absolutely. Take a dump and look at
it. Okay. Simple enough.
So that's really simple. We can get a more sophisticated analysis that's available commercially that will say, these are the predominant species that you have. And that can be really interesting. It's really interesting to us as researchers. But as researchers, when we look at that, we will say, yeah, the research is sort of not clear what these species mean or don't mean, what's helpful, what's not helpful. What's much more important is what processes can those microbes do for you? And so the test I run will give me a report on about 20,000 processes. There are no commercial tests that can do that yet. So I don't. There are times where, yes, it may be useful to look at what species you have and should we use some herbals to try and get a better balance. That may be useful. I can make many of those decisions based clinically as I talk with you and look at your symptoms. Just look at your rock, log, snake, pudding, tea questionnaire that we have, and then begin with some herbal approaches. And I don't rely on that testing nearly as much as many of my functional medicine colleagues because I'm probably much more familiar with the research, and that the research is not as clear about which species that is harmful. It's much more nuanced in terms of what are the processes that can happen. It's sort of like, we thought as soon as we got the human genome sequenced, we'd be able to treat every chronic disease. And then we had to discover, that was not going to help us that much. That's a much more complicated interaction between your genes and all of the environmental factors. And so we can get the names of all your microbes, But once again, it's a much more complicated process of, so we know the names, but what processes can those microbes do for you? And those microbes are promiscuous. They're swapping genes all the time. So just because your microbe is XYZ, it doesn't mean that it can do process ABC.
So dietary changes make up the bulk of your protocol, but I know there's also some lifestyle changes as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So can you talk about some of those?
Sure. So I'm going to step ahead or back, maybe is the better way to put this. The biggest reasons people succeed or fail is our ability to adopt and sustain diet and lifestyle choices. And our habits, our daily lives are governed by automatic behaviors that are subconscious. It takes a whole lot of effort for us to change our behaviors. And it is a phenomenally big ask to have people give up today's pleasures for tomorrow's benefits. Which is why it is so difficult to get people to stop cigarettes, to stop gambling addictions, to stop alcohol and substance abuse. It's profoundly, profoundly difficult. And our food choices are all driven by pleasure, and the food industry pays food scientists a lot of money to develop products that give us intense pleasure and cravings to drive overconsumption. So one of the first things that we do is we go through a number of steps to help people grow their internal motivation, do the work that's going to be required to create these new habits. And so a big question that I walk people through is, what do you want your health for? Why do you want to do this? And then help create linkages between their inner passion, what they care so deeply about, and what are the next steps that we can take on their healing journey. And so that's sort of the Wahls behavior change process that we walk people through. That is a very big part of the revision in my book to help people be much more successful. Then in that, we can talk about the issues of loneliness and connection. If we are lonely and isolated, that really drives up the inflammatory molecules and accelerates high blood pressure, diabetes, which is a combination of diabetes and obesity, mental health problems, and autoimmune issues, cancer also. So finding ways to help people stay connected to friends, to family, to what matters deeply to them, very, very important. We talk about gratitude. You might think about now, many of us are severely stressed by what's happening in our communities with this pandemic and the isolation, economic stress. So, and I'm talking about this with my family and with my tribe, is that if we are still alive, there are things for which we can still have gratitude. So, if I'm feeling stressed, and surely I am, and surely most of our listeners are right now, I spend a little time every day thanking my family for what I'm grateful for and telling them, like, I'm so grateful I'm not having any optic neuritis that I can see. I'm grateful that the sensation on my face is normal. I don't have these incapacitating electrical face pain, and that I know we will get through all of this. And I'm grateful that my daughter's semester in Italy occurred in 2016 as opposed to 2020. And my daughter's like, Mom, you are just so amazing. But I am getting more appreciative of how useful it is to find things that you're grateful for every day.
Yeah, it completely changes your whole attitude and perspective when you can focus on gratitude, because it is easy to focus on all the negativity, and that just takes you in that downward spiral, and you're not going anywhere positive. So if we can just take those few minutes in the morning or throughout the day to focus on what we're grateful for, then the rest of the day becomes a bit easier.
Yeah, I mean, we're wired to create or seek pleasure and comfort and to avoid loss. And so that drives a lot of our behavior. If we can intentionally stay connected to people that we care about and stay connected to, as difficult as these times may be, there are still things for which I can be very pleased, very grateful, and very joyful about. And know that We will all get through this together, and visualize the better place that you will discover in your life and the lives of people that are important to you.
Yes. Very comforting words. Is there anything else in terms, since this is a very timely subject, in terms of staying calm and sane while on self-quarantine and staying healthy, keeping your immune system up?
Yeah, sure. So, and again, I want to acknowledge that there is no cure for COVID. Things are changing quickly, so please always check back with the CDC and the WHO website on the coronavirus. In the meantime, what I'm telling people is, for a public health basis, to help protect the healthcare workers in the hospitals, yes, maintain that 6-foot space all around, wash your hands a lot. That's great to protect our hospitals. To protect you and your family, we have to really pay attention to our self-cares. So in terms of your self-talk, self-messaging, I've already talked about that. In terms of nutrition, there are some key nutrients that we know are vital for immune cell health. Vitamin C, very, very important for immune cells. And there's some evidence that vitamin C in high doses can be very helpful as we're fighting infections, both viral and bacterial. Foods that are good sources of vitamin C are greens, citrus, and sauerkraut. So I have lots of heads of cabbages in my refrigerator, and I'm making sauerkraut. So we have sauerkraut all of the time with all of our meals. So we'll keep that going. And then you can talk with your personal physician about should you take additional vitamin C supplements as well, and that may be beneficial. But clearly adding greens, sauerkraut, citrus to your diet now, every day, very, very helpful. We want to have plenty of vitamin A. That your requirements for vitamin A during infection also go up. I don't want you to get toxic on vitamin A. So my advice is liver once a week. That is very, very helpful. 6 to 8 ounces, again, to support your immune cells. If you can't do the liver, then you could, on my shop page, terrywahls.com/shop, we have some organ meat capsules, and you could use that alternatively. Zinc is another key nutrient, very important for immune cells. So the food sources for zinc, oysters, mussels, clams, and liver. And what I like about the organ meats is that those minerals are easily absorbed, and you have all of the required minerals. Because most nutrients have cofactors, and so if you have a food-based source of these nutrients, it'll be in the proper balance and ratios with the other micronutrients as well. So this is another reason why liver once a week would be really very helpful. And again, you can speak with your personal physician about would you benefit from taking a modest amount of zinc during this pandemic crisis. And so, yes, it may be appropriate to have a zinc supplement. Another nutrient we can see that's very helpful is selenium. And we know that in a number of localities, when these coronaviruses have been more deadly, are parts of the world that have low selenium intakes. And have a higher rate of selenium deficiency and insufficiency. So I'm telling my folks, have a Brazil nut every day, maybe 2, to be sure that your selenium intake is adequate. The next nutrient that I think about is iodine, because again, our immune cells use iodine as they're killing off the bacteria and the viruses. If you have too much iodine, you can have some thyroid disease. If you have too little iodine, you're more vulnerable to infection and thyroid disease. So a kelp capsule a couple times a week, a seaweed in your diet 1 time a week, I think can be very helpful. And it's a way, if you use the food basis, that's always preferable than taking supplements. Or I should say, not necessarily preferable, it's safer. If you have a practitioner who's comfortable with integrative medicine, functional medicine, they can help you sort out and monitor what's the correct dose for you. If you're using food, and I've outlined that in my book, the kind of protocol that I used in the Wahls protocol would be anticipated to optimize your immune cell function so that you'll have the balanced response to the viral infections that will self-correct. Because when we get infected with the viruses, Our immune cells has to rev up to fight off the virus, and then they have to properly rev back down when the virus is gone. And that's where having a fully healthy and optimally function immune system will make both arms of this process work better. The revving up to fight the virus and the revving back down when you've controlled the virus.
This brings up a great or interesting point in terms of the foods that you were saying that are helpful for making sure our immune system is strong. They're the same foods that are in the Wahls protocol. So the Wahls protocol is specifically for people who are trying to reverse symptoms of autoimmune conditions. But would you say for the average person, it's still a healthy diet, or are there any tweaks?
This would be great.
Yeah.
No, I think this would be great. If you're completely healthy, do you have to go gluten-free or not? If you're healthy, no meds, no symptoms, probably not required. However, because if your blood sugar is a little bit high, that severely compromises your immune cells. This is a great time to ditch the grains. If you're a vegetarian, you need gluten-free grains and legumes. So those people still need that. Everyone else, I'd much rather you have more non-starchy vegetables and meat and eliminate the sugar and processed foods. Yeah, having some legumes and gluten-free grains now to have on hand for shelf-stable food, because we don't know how long we're going to have greater constraints on our ability to shop. I can understand why some people will make that choice, and that could be a very reasonable choice.
One last question I'd love to ask, which I ask all my guests. Is there just one tip you can leave our listeners on how they can live a happier and healthier life?
Well, I think the most profound decision you can make is know what you want your health for. Because my success in making any change depends on the clarity that I have and understanding why I'd want to go through the work of creating these new health habits. And so as I was profoundly disabled and having to adjust my life as a progressively more ill, more disabled individual, the fact I had great clarity on wanting to raise 2 children who would be successful adults emotionally and financially left me thinking like, okay, I'm not going to be able to use athletics. I'm not going to be able to use wilderness travel. What tools do I have? And I finally got to the point, the only tool I really had was I could get up and go to work every day, and I could give them more chores. And I could acknowledge that life is difficult, but we do the best that we can. Because if I didn't do that, I'd be teaching them that when life is difficult, you give up. And I knew that was not the message I wanted to teach. So what is your why? Get deeply connected to what is your why.
Dr. Wahls, thank you so much for being here and sharing your insights. For anyone interested in learning how to reverse their symptoms of autoimmune disease, check out Dr. Wahls' book, The Wahls Protocol, A Radical New Way to Treat All Chronic Autoimmune Conditions Using Paleo Principles. To celebrate the launch of the book, I'm gifting one lucky listener a copy. Simply head over to my Instagram @Maria Marlowe for instructions on how to enter.